resume. Okay. Oh, wait. Is there anybody out there? Let's see. Seems weird. Okay. Well. All right. Well, I'm on and I'm plugged in, so I'm going to assume I have sound. Oh, okay. Okay, people who are out there, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, and I can hear you too, so that's good. Excellent, cool. All right. So here's the plan for today. Let me bring the mic over here. So last week we talked about discontinuity, right? We started talking about discontinuity and or piecewise model. Today, and you had a homework on piecewise models, right? So today we're gonna continue to talk about piecewise models a little bit. I think we've said a lot of what we need to say there, most, if not all. But we are going to do this comparison of a piecewise model to a polynomial. We haven't said everything we're going to say because we are going to do a piecewise model today. So that's going to be sort of the difference between, last week when we were doing discontinuity, we sort of had this 2-piece thing, and this week we're going to do a 3-piece thing. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of modeling discontinuity versus piecewise modeling in terms of just the semantics of what we're talking about. And then very excitingly, we're going to do polynomial models too today. So we'll talk about quadratic models and cubic models. And then what we're going to do is we've got this nice example with the NYS data set. So we're going to compare a 3-piece piecewise model to a cubic model using the NYS data set. And then I'm talking, I realize I made the right decision about not making the residual packet handouts for today. Like, am I really going to get to residuals today? No, we're definitely not going to get to residuals today. Then, after all that, if there's time, and I hope there will be time for this, I've got a handout. I was sort of debating about talking about alternative covariance structures for longitudinal models. And I think it's, we've spent a lot of time talking about tau matrices and sort of talking about covariances, variance-covariance components. So I do want to at least touch on this idea of alternative variance-covariance structures. And especially sort of, I want us to think a little bit about how the different residuals that we are estimating, sort of how they get combined together into one composite residual. And then that, I think, will inform our thoughts about what the structure of the composite error variance covariance structure looks like, and how you could actually fit different error covariance structures. Having said all that, I should probably, we're not yet. You don't have to give us that yet. We're not going to, I'm going to talk about it sort of theoretically and conceptually, but we're not going to fit any multi-level models with these alternative error covariance structures for a couple reasons. One, it's getting late in the semester and we're running out of time. But two, you actually can't fit these models using LME4. So LME4 has a lot of advantages as a multi-level package, but one of the disadvantages is that it doesn't allow for the fitting of alternative error variance covariance structures, which is not like the biggest deal in the world, because there are other packages, and probably the one that I would have shown you, or I'm going to show you another package, but I decided that was not a great use of our time, is NLME. So it's NLME, and it's actually Doug Bates, who's sort of the creator of the LME4 package. He's also one of the creators of the NLME package, which predates LME4. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's odd because this is an older package, but it does more. And again, it sort of has to do with the sort of what's going on underneath the surface and sort of the way that the way that the computation is happening. I'm not going to say too much about that, but so NLME is an older package. The syntax is a little bit different. Again, if you know modeling, it's not that hard to figure out. But I just, you know, I don't think it's like a great use of our time to spend a lot of time tackling a whole nother package at this point in the semester. So we're going to talk about it conceptually. You're not going to have to do anything on alternative error covariance structures for your homework this week or any of the weeks, because I'm not going to show you how to do that. But I do want you to sort of conceptually and theoretically understand this, and I think it'll help you to make more sense of, you know, what's going on in multi-level models in general. And then from there, but not this week, because now that I'm talking, I realize we'll be lucky to get through all of that this week. Next week will be our week where we talk about residuals. We'll do residual analysis. And I think for those of you who took multiple regression with Eric, I know that he spends a good deal of time talking about residuals. Is that true? Right? I mean, you know, no judgment passed, but just like you talk about residuals, right? So, but as you can imagine, you know, you only had one residual there. You only had your little old E, right? And now we've got residuals at level 1 and we've got residuals at level 2. And so, you know, there's even more to think about in terms of residual analysis. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to the kinds of stuff you probably looked at in multiple regression, but, you know, there's just more going on. Just like everything else in multi-level modeling, there's just more going on. So that's the plan. And that, yeah, so I don't think we'll get to residuals this week. I'm glad I didn't make that. I'm glad I didn't print out that packet. Every time I print out a packet early, then I want to, like, you know, mess around with it in the week in the interim. And actually, I had like half of the residual stuff done, but I knew we wouldn't get past that, but I don't think we're going to start. So next week will be residuals. And then after that, we have Thanksgiving break. I know, I think we're all ready for break. And then following Thanksgiving, there are 2 classes. So just to kind of review, the class after Thanksgiving, we will be talking about power analysis, sample size, and sort of design issues, design, sample size, and power issues in multi-level models. And so I don't know, for better or for worse, I don't know if you'll be, I'm going to look at all of you all, age your reactions. Next week is our last week with R. I know, right? I saw some happy faces. So next week will be, I mean, when I say our last week with R, I guess I don't totally mean that. I just mean like we won't be doing anything new in R after Thanksgiving, because when we do the power and sample size and design issues, there's a lot to talk about theoretically, obviously. And then I'm going to show you freeware power analysis software program that's super easy to use. That's specifically like a free power analysis program for multi-level modeling. It's not one that you've probably ever used before because it's specific to multi-level modeling. So it's not like GPower or anything like that. But it's super, super easy to use. And that's the way again, there are other ways to do power analyses, but this is super easy. So we'll do that. And then the final week will actually be our review session. So be thinking now about all the things you want to talk about and review for our final. I mean, you're reviewing stuff all the time, but else I need to say before we launch into today. Okay, cool.
Maybe, but we'll talk during the break.
Oh,
I have some, but I'm not sure.
oh, okay. Well, that sounds, I don't know.
It's not ominous.
Okay, good. I was gonna.
No,
It
it's
sounds
not.
ominous.
I just was up really late.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Okay. So on that note, let's get cracking. So actually, before we jump into anything with R, I want to actually talk about the example that we're going to do today, which will be a nice kind of review of piecewise models, and then we'll kind of launch into polynomial models. So, okay, yes. Yep. 2 extra printouts, I think. Let me give those out to, because I have one look at me. I'm so proud of myself because I'm usually generally very disorganized, but even I put my art and markdown files into a binder because I kept like looking around my office going, so.
It's like a book on my shelf.
Yeah, no, I mean, usually like I can have one of these for SEM. I just like, after I do the example, I just like, but no, I mean, I probably should. I don't know. I feel very proud of myself. Anyway, so I got my own art marked down here. This is my last copy. Those other ones were extras. Okay. So piecewise and polynomial models. So let's just start by kind of, let me start by talking about the example that we're going to do today. So it's our NYS example. Remember, this is the example where we have 5 time points, and we're going to look at attitudes toward antisocial peers. We're not going to use the time varying covariate of exposure here. We're not actually going to do any level 2 variables in this example. I don't think. Maybe I put one in at the end. I can't even remember, but we're really mostly focused on our level 1 model. And you remember that we fit this before and we fit it as a linear model, but what I didn't tell you when we fit it as a linear model is that, and I think maybe looks like this, that to actually look at attitudes toward antisocial behavior at ages 11, 12, 13, say, you get a curve that, or you get sort of a trajectory that is distinctly not linear. And what it really kind of looks like is that from like, we didn't do any of the NYS example last week, right? I'm just making sure. All the weeks are running into each other. So from 11 to 12, there's relatively low growth in antisocial attitudes. And then, not surprisingly, if any of you have teenagers at home, young teenagers at home from 12, I happen to have a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old, so I can really relate to this example. From ages 12 to 14, there's sort of this, let's call it like a spurt almost, a growth spurt in terms of antisocial attitudes, right? And all kinds of other things, just general.
It's 12 next week.
Sorry. Let this be a lesson to you, Pam. I actually, my kids are good, but I did used to, in another life a long time ago, I used to be a middle school teacher, which is, could you imagine me as a middle school teacher? I was a horrible middle school teacher. I was really bad.
Telling things were orthogonal.
I was. Well, I taught gifted students, so that was good. But even so, I was just like, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, oh, God. So anyway, but the thing about middle school students is they definitely, I mean, this is true. They're like, they come into 6th grade and they're so sweet. And then something happens to them in like 7th grade. And I think they kind of come out of it a little by 9th grade. Yes. Oh, attitudes toward, so it's an antisocial attitude. So sort of like, oh, I'm sorry, I keep saying attitude toward antisocial peers, but that's not what I mean. It's antisocial attitudes. It's exposure to antisocial peers was our time varying covariate. It's just antisocial attitudes. So basically like, you know, being bad, right? Higher is not desirable in this case. Antisocial attitudes. Yeah, so sort of, you don't know anything, right? Like, yeah, being more likely to talk back, to steal, to lie, to cheat, those kinds of things. Okay, so back to this. So we have this spurt from 12 to 14, and then from 14 to 15, actually a leveling off. So again, it's not like the antisocial attitudes go back to baseline, right? They're not the sweet cherubic children that they were at age 11, but they kind of stabilize in their higher antisocialness by age 14, and then off they.
My son's 18. I would say that's
right. They don't again.
No.
But they don't keep. Luckily, they don't just like be really bad if they just kept on path, right? That would be bad. That's not. Okay, again, and this is like on average, and again, remember that everybody's got their own trajectories and everything like that. Okay, so that's going to be our piecewise model. So this is a good review from last week because remember we talked about sort of modeling different slopes last week, right? We talked about modeling different slopes and different intercepts or different, change in level, change in slope. So a couple things. Let's think about a couple different things. First, I want us to figure out what our coding system is going to be for this, for a piecewise model. And then the second thing is I want us to think about, do you think it makes more sense? Remember how last week I said there are two equivalent sort of forms that we could take for these models. We could do slope and change in slope, or we could do separate slopes. So let's tackle that sort of theoretical question first. Do you think it makes more sense in this case to do slope and change in slope or to do separate slopes? And why do you think that? What do you think and why? So this is not a statistical question. This is really more of a sort of a design or theoretical question. Anybody? Yes, I totally agree. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Yes, I agree. So the first thing I would say is now that we've got two changes, right? And this isn't really like experimental changes, right? But now that we've got these sort of three different slopes, I think having slope and then change in slope and then another change in slope could be kind of weird, right? And then would it be, again, I mean, it might make sense in certain circumstances. I'm not saying that anytime you have three pieces, it doesn't make sense. I could imagine a situation where if this were baseline, this is intervention, kind of like we were talking about with single subject, and this is another base, and this is we withdraw the intervention. Then, maybe you would want to make these two the same, let's say, and make this one different or something. So there could be, whatever. So maybe you would want to look at change of this from the baseline. But I do agree that all other things being equal, if I've got more than two slopes, the slope change in slope thing, I'm well, now I need two changes in slope, and that kind of makes my brain hurt. So I think I would like to have three separate slopes here. I think that would be easier to think about, right? So that's what we are going to use a three separate slope format. I just think it makes sense here too. Again, sort of like a developmental thing. I want to know what's the growth rate from 11 to 12. I want to know what's the growth rate from 12 to 14, not what's the change in growth rate, but what is the growth rate from 12 to 14? And then I want to know what's the growth rate from 14 to 15. Okay, so everybody with me? So we could do slope and change in slope, but we're not going to do that here. We're just going to do three separate slopes. So now the next question is, how are we going to code those three separate slopes? Okay, so let's say we've got each here is 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. And I'm going to need three pieces, right? I'm just going to call them P1, P2, and P3 because there are three different pieces. So how am I going to code these three different pieces to get my three different slopes? Anybody want to take a shot at? Oh, and before I do this, let me just also give the caveat. We've got 5 time points, right? So how many randomly varying coefficients can I have with 5 time points? Remember, we talked about that a lot last week too. So if I have 5 time points, how many randomly varying coefficients can I have? 4, right? And if I fit 3 slopes and a randomly varying coefficient, then I have 4, right? So I can actually allow all 3 of these pieces to randomly vary, and I am identified. I can do it. But I just want to say, our example, we're doing this for pedagogical reasons, but if you really think that you need 3 pieces, you have a slope that needs a cubic function, trajectory that needs either a cubic function or 3 pieces, even though 5 is the minimum number of time points that you could collect, that is not the optimal number of time points that you can collect, right? So like if you were at the design stage of this study, you should not say, I think I need a trajectory like this, let me collect 5 time points. You should probably say, let me collect at least 7 time points, right? So we're fitting this with 5 and we can fit it with 5, but I just want to go on record as saying that's not optimal. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, we talked about this a bit last week, and I think we'll talk about it some more too. But remember we said that it's really about, I had started off by saying if you're fitting a linear model, you have to have at least 3 time points, right? To fit a straight line, because we've got a randomly varying slope and intercept. And that sounds good. But the reality is that the generalization of that rule it's really, you need to have 1 more time point than you have random effects. Yeah. So with 4 time points, you can actually have you can have 2 randomly varying slopes and a randomly varying intercept. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, no problem. Okay. So ready to talk about how we're going to code these pieces then? What do you think? How are we going to code piece 1? Our first slope, it's going to capture growth from 11 to 12. This is like our first block, right? Capturing growth from 11 to 12, and then it stops. Yeah, so 0, 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay, great. How about our second piece? 0, 0, 1, 2, 2, right? Good, because we stop it. Hey, you guys are getting good at this. And then our third piece? 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. And yeah, so right, so 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. So those are our 3 pieces. Okay. Does everybody understand that? So we would have to, again, and we would have to actually create these codes, and we now need these 3 different sort of time clocks or time variables in R, right? So we'll create these codes, and we can easily recode from our age variable or our original linear time variable to do that. Okay, now here's another question. Because let's imagine that, the way that I've drawn this, right? It sort of looks like, this slope is really different from the 11 to 12 and the 14 to 15 growth slope. But I might want to test whether these slopes are the same, right? Like is growth, like, okay, so there's a spurt period in here, but like is growth before and after the spurt period, are those 2 growth slopes equal to each other? See what I'm saying? So like maybe I think that there's one sort of growth rate sort of pre that 12 to 14 age, right? That sort of critical period. And then there's another growth slope for that sort of critical period. How, if I really wanted to code this as 2 pieces that capture this setup, how would I code the 2 pieces? Follow my question? Okay. Anybody have an idea? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm using red here. I want to do 2 pieces. Piece 1 is going to be 0, 1, 1, 1, 2. And piece 2 is going to be the same, exactly. 2. So piece 2 is still going to be 0, 0, 1, 2, 2. And now I don't have piece 3. So I'm just going to put little dashes there because it's a 2-piece solution. And if you look at this, maybe we shouldn't put the dashes because now that's distracting. But if you look at this, right, you can see that my new piece 1 is actually just 1 plus piece 3 gives me my new piece 1. Do you see that? Like if I took 0 plus 0, I get 0. 1 plus 0 is 1. 1 plus 0 is 1. 1 plus 0 is 1. And 1 plus 1 is 2. Right? So I really just collapsed pieces 1 and 3 into one set of, right, it's one set of codes, that's one piece, and piece 2 actually remains the same here. And so what this is really saying is that, right, my first clock turns on at age 11, and then I stop it at age 12. I pause that clock at age 12, right? I turn on piece 2, the second time clock, that turns on at age 12, and it clocks the passage of time until age 14, at which point it stops. And then I go back and I turn on the first time clock again, right? And now it's capturing the passage of time from 14 to 15. And I could actually test, I can actually look at which of these two models is, a better model, right? Well, theoretically, if the second version makes sense, if the two-piece version makes sense, what would I expect to see in terms of model fit? Well, yeah, maybe that was not a fair question. I mean, better, but like, what will the deviance can't go? The deviance can't go down because I'm using fewer parameters, right? It can only go up. But I wouldn't expect it to go up by much. Like I would expect the deviance to stay the same or go up just a little bit, right? Because remember, whenever we use fewer parameters, like the deviance always goes up. So when we do those likelihood ratio tests and we compare to like a chi-square, when the chi-square isn't statistically significant, we favor the more parsimonious model. So that's why I hedge a little when you say like better, because it's like, well, we're going to favor it and it's going to be not worse, right? So what we would expect to see, if this is reasonable, is that the deviance would be generally about the same, right? Might go up a tiny bit, might stay the same, but it's a one parameter. Well, it's not true at all. Well, it really depends on my tau matrix, right? Really depends on my tau matrix. In the terms of the fixed effects, there's a one parameter difference, but this is actually a much simpler model because what happens to my tau matrix? If I were estimating an unstructured tau matrix, which maybe, we haven't talked about whether I was or wasn't estimating an unstructured tau matrix. But if I were estimating an unstructured tau matrix, I go from model, right, where I had 1, 2, and 3. I'm just going to sort of show how many elements are in my tau matrix there, right? So with 3 pieces, I've got 4 variances. I've got 6 covariances. So I've actually got 10 tau matrix plus a sigma squared. You're going to count all of the variance components. That's a lot, right? If I collapse these 2 into 1, and now I only estimate, should have turned off my ringer. Hold on a second. There, better. Okay. If I actually had an unstructured tau matrix and now I'm going to estimate 2 pieces instead of 3, then I'm actually knocking out 4 additional parameters, right? Because I'm only going to have 1 variance, or this slope that captures these 2 time periods, and I'm not going to have all of these other covariances. So actually, again, if I were starting with an unstructured tau matrix, I'm losing 1 fixed effect, and I'm losing 4 variance covariance components. That's actually, when you think about it that way, this 2-piece model is actually quite a bit simpler, right? Okay. And so if the deviance doesn't increase by a lot, right, then we would definitely favor the simpler model. So, and we can compare the more parameterized and less parameterized model. They are going to be nested, so we can compare them with a likelihood ratio. All right, so I think that's everything that I wanted to say about the 3-piece and the 2-piece model. So let's talk about polynomial model. So I gotta say, I show a little bit my bias here. I really love piecewise models. I think they're really fun. I like having these different slopes. I think they're really sort of easy to interpret. But polynomial models are another way that we can, and I like them too. They're fun, but you'll see they're a little bit less easy to interpret. So we're getting there. Polynomial models are another way that we can actually fit nonlinearity, right? So thinking back to, I don't know, middle school or high school, somewhere in the recesses of your math brains, no? Do you remember polynomials at all? Tiny bit? Okay. So we're going to start at ground zero, literally, and we're going to start with like what's a zero order polynomial, and we'll work our way out. Okay. So his linear models are actually in the polynomial family. They're just let's see. Okay. So a zero order polynomial, and I'm going to use the level one. No, we're just going to think about level one here, and I'm going to use the level one notation. So I'm going to use pies here as I'm writing things out. Okay. So, all right, zero order polynomial model. So for a zero order polynomial model, we're going to be estimating a level, but we're estimating like a level, but we're not actually going to be estimating any kind of a change in level. And so a zero order polynomial model looks like this. Y sub ti is equal to pi naught, right? Times time raised to the power of zero. Okay. So, I mean, that's right. I'm going to leave off the subscripts for right now because it doesn't really matter too much, like the TI and the. Okay, now that I said it, I'm going on. But that's not really the focus here. The real focus here is really what's going on right here. Okay. So what is anything raised to the power of zero? One. That's right. So anything that you raise to the power of zero is one. So that means that what I really have there is pi zero times one. Huh. So remember when we were looking at like our design matrix last week, and remember I've said that the intercept is always implicitly multiplied by one, right? But I mean, it doesn't really matter. We don't usually write that because like anything multiplied by one is just its thing. But so you can see that this is just basically saying y sub ti is, so my score at time t, right? Person I score at time t is just a function of their intercept, right? Plus e sub ti. So yeah, okay, plus some error. So and remember that the intercepts can, if we were to go to level 2 now, we could say there, right? That my intercepts can randomly vary across people because I'd have like beta not plus r, right? That should be r sub not I. Well, that's really not j. All right. So what this means, though, and why I'm sort of pointing this out, is it means that every person can have their own intercept, right? So this is a very simple model. It's saying every person has their own level, right? There is no growth, but it also doesn't mean that there's no change. I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody's exactly the same across time because we have this e sub ti. So at every time point, there is some error, right? So what would that look like? It would look like something like this. Let's imagine stuff like this, right? So say this is their level, this is their average level, and then this is really captures these E's, right? But they're not actually always at their own, not always at their own sort of homeostatic level. And this is person one, and then maybe person two has something that looks like this, right? And they've got their own level. Oh, now it looks like they're equal, but they're not because whatever. Because this is down here further, but you get the idea. So we got different people, and they've got different levels, so that's not supposed to be a slope. That seems like a really, really boring model, and it is in the sense that you're not allowing for systematic change across time. But I just want to remind you that sometimes we don't expect to see systematic change across time, right? So you could be, I mean, we talked about this a long, long time ago. We said like maybe something like the relationship between stress and mood, or, well, like mood. Let's just take mood as our outcome variable, like what kind of mood you're in. Maybe we don't actually think that if we're asking adults, or anybody really for that matter, what their mood is across 30 days, we don't necessarily think that we're going to see like people's moods are systematically getting better, or people's moods are systematically getting worse. We think their moods won't be the same from day to day. There'll be a lot of variability in their moods from day to day, but we don't necessarily expect to see systematic decline or systematic increase. But again, so this model could actually fit that. And then you could add in time varying covariates. So it's not as dumb a model as it might seem, because again, I could put in stress, let's say, as a time varying covariate as a predictor of mood. So now I've got, your mood on day at time t, right? The mood for person I at time t is a function of their overall like mood level, because different people are going to be different in terms of whether they're generally in good moods or bad moods or whatever. So it'll be their overall intercept or level plus, let's say, we could have then a 1 sub I times stress, right? TI would be right in there, plus E sub TI. So I could actually add in time varying covariates that would help to predict why, so maybe, in that case, maybe it's that these were low stress days, right? And these were higher stress days. And so stress helps to predict a person's mood. So I bring this up because, again, it seems like it seems like such a silly model that when would you ever use this? But actually this gets used quite a bit in intensive longitudinal, daily diary kinds of studies, where often you really don't think that you're not really expecting systematic growth, but what you are trying to do is sort of track how certain time varying covariates actually relate to the outcome. And so it gets to be a much more interesting, again, if all you had was intercept only, that is kind of a boring model, but you can add time varying covariates to this model, and it can become a far more interesting model. But the important thing for us is just to remember that a zero order polynomial model is really just saying there's a level, I'm not allowing for any change at all, right? So there's no change in level, there's just a level. So no change, right? Just no change. Let's call it our no change model. Level. This. Okay, next model. Oops. Next model is going to be what's called a first order polynomial, aka linear growth model. So this model is going to be a model that you're very, very, very familiar with. So now I've got y ti is equal to, again, we've got I naught times time to the 0 power, right? Plus I1 times time raised to the first power, plus, again, we've got our plus our error, right? So here, I mean, this is the same model that we've talked about, the only over and over and over again, when we talk about linear growth models, the only thing that's different is I'm just pointing out here that, that our pi naught is really pi naught times time raised to the power of 0, which is really the same pi naught I times 1 times plus 1i, right, times time raised to the first power. I don't think it really matters where I put that in the parentheses so much, but where time raised to the first power is just itself, right? So it's just time. So this is, if I have time like 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, that is time raised to the first power. Okay, what does this first order polynomial model say? It says here we said change is zero, right? There is no change. Here we're saying there is a change, there's change, right? But the rate of change is constant. So there's no change in the rate of change. And this, we're going to get really we're going to say change a lot over the next few minutes. So stick with me on this, all right? So there's change, but that rate of change is constant. So there's no change in the rate of change. Yeah. And that's an important thing about linear models, that we are assuming that the rate of change is constant across time, right? So if you've got a linear model, we're really saying, it doesn't really matter where you are, where I looked at you, right? I can be looking at you at this sort of part of the curve or this part of the curve or this part of the curve. It's not really a curve, it's just a straight line. So the rate of change is going to be the same wherever I am. It's the same whether I'm right. The rate of change is the same between 0 and 1, and between 1 and 2, between 3, and between 3 and 4, because there's this constant rate of change. So I've got a rate of change, but the rate of change is constant, and that is a linear growth model. So we've got so no change in the change. Yeah? All right. So far, so good. So now we get to our next model, which is called a second order polynomial model. Also known as, and by the way, you'll find more neatly written versions of all these descriptions in your markdown. More commonly known as a quadratic model. So now what I'm going to do is I've got YTI, function of pi naught times time, right, raised to the power of 0, plus pi 1 times time, raised to the first power, plus pi 2 times time squared. Okay, so I'm going to take what I do to get this is I'm going to square time. So coming back over here for a second to get rid of this. If time goes up, if time looks like this, if we're going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is time, right? What is time squared going to look like? 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, exactly. So literally in my model, I'm going to have, right? Again, remember the piecewise model, we had like these different pieces. So we had like piece 1 and piece 2. Now I'm going to have, instead of having like piece 1 and piece 2, now I've got, time just that looks just like our regular linear time. It's not going to be interpreted the same way anymore, but like the code looks identical to what we had for our linear growth slope, right? But now I also have time squared. And to create this, by the way, is really easy, right? Because I can just take this time variable and I can square it, right? And it's going to give me time squared. But now I've got this time squared variable. And I think the important thing to really notice is that because time is squared, like as time goes up by 1 unit, time squared goes up by like a lot more than 1 unit, right? So yeah, right. It's like, you see it goes up like here, it's going up by 1 unit, right? Actually, there is a really interesting, there is actually, if you're into math, there's a really interesting sort of form in which it goes up. Like notice, goes up by 1 unit here, goes up by 3 units here, goes up by 5 units here, goes up by 7 units here, goes up by 9 units here, right? 36, write that, but it goes up by 11 units there if I could, right? So do you see the pattern? Right? So as you're squaring, actually, this squared term is increasing, it's increasing basically, by 2, right, each time. So now, though, because whatever, I'm not going to have a constant rate of change across time anymore because I'm going to have 2 coefficients, right? I'm going to have this coefficient that's telling me about, that's going to get multiplied by time. So it's giving me like, as time goes up by 1 unit, right? This is going to go up by 1 units. I'm going to have a second coefficient that says as time squared goes up by 1 unit, this goes up by whatever pi 2 units is. But because time squared gets big so much faster than time does, like what ends up happening is that, often what you'll see when you look at a model like this is that pi 2 looks small. Like it often looks small in comparison to pi 1. And it doesn't actually exert a strong influence sort of at the beginning because, whatever it is, like if you think about it, the first time point, it doesn't do anything, right? Because like we can think about that for a minute too. The intercept is still going to be at time 0 because, right, it's still going to be the predicted value at time 0 because like at time 0, time squared is also 0. And when you go from 0 to 1, yeah, you've got basically, you're going to have pi 1 times time plus pi 2 times time squared. But like, they're going to basically exert equal weight on your predicted value at that point, right? Because it's pi 1 times 1 plus pi 2 times 1. You see what I mean? But as you go up, when you get to like, let's say time 0.5, it's going to be pi 1 times 5 plus pi 2 times 25. And so like that pi 2, even though when you like look at it, it might look relatively small, it's getting multiplied by the square of time. And so as we go further and further across time, right, this number is getting bigger and bigger. And so it's sort of exerting a bigger and bigger influence across time, right? So remember I said for the first order linear model, we had a constant rate of change. We no longer have a constant rate of change. We have a rate of change that is changing across time, right? So we don't have one rate of change, we have a changing rate of change. And really, that's really what this quadratic is helping us to model the change in the rate of change. Yeah? Okay. So we've got, so we're allowing for change in the rate of change. I'm going to say more about that. So we've got change. Well, no, maybe I'll say more about that now. We've got change in the rate of change. So I'm going to have to, is it okay if I erase this? I want to show you what this ends up looking like. So let's think about this. Okay, so let's say I'm not going to worry about pi naught right now. Pi naught is just going to sort of set the level when time is equal to 0. So that kind of puts us, again, like imagine it's time, let's say this is y. So pi naught is going to sort of set where somebody is at time 0, right? But time, and I've got time squared, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 16, there. Okay, so let's imagine remember, we're going to have a parameter associated with time. So we're going to have like a pi, we're going to have a slope. And the slope could be positive, or that slope could be negative, or I mean, that slope could be zero, right? So let's imagine for a second that the pi 1, which is associated with this first order time, is positive. And let's say that pi 2, which is associated with the squared term, is also positive. Are you with me? Okay. So if pi 1 is positive, what does that really mean? Well, it doesn't actually mean the same thing that it did in a linear model. Remember, in a linear model, we had a linear growth slope. Growth was constant across time. So I could just say, like, this is the linear, right? This is the growth rate. But now, again, thinking back to this whole semester when I'm like, oh, we always have to interpret when everything else in the model is zero, right? I need to interpret pi 1 in the context of when pi 2 is zero. And that might seem, or when time, when not pi 2 is zero. I'm sorry, I misspoke. When time is zero, that's what I meant to say. Or when time squared is zero. It's really what I was thinking. So what does that mean? It means this is my growth rate. And what we say is it's my instantaneous growth rate, because growth isn't constant anymore. The growth rate is actually changing across time. So I can't just say it's my growth rate. It's my instantaneous growth rate when time is zero. So now pi 1 is my instantaneous growth rate, or rate of change, when time is equal to zero, because when time is equal to zero, time squared is also going to be zero. So it tells me about what does that growth rate look like at that moment in time. But because the rate of change is changing, you get a different growth rate. Basically, at every moment in time, you're going to have a different growth rate. So the way I like to think about this is when pi 1 is positive, like let's say this is time 0 here, it sort of tells me which way am I pointing, right? Like again, everything's instantaneous, but like, what's my growth rate at this moment? So let's say if it's positive, right? I'm pointed up, like headed in a positive direction when time is equal to 0. If it's negative, I'm headed in a downward direction when time is 0. And it could actually be 0. And if it were 0, that would mean I'm basically flat, right? There's no discernible growth when time is equal to 0. And obviously, because the rate of change is changing across time, the way that you center time is going to have an impact then on what this slope is, right? Because if you sort of think about it, if you had let's just say that this is your trajectory right now, back to this minute, but like, if you had something that looks like this, if you were to center time over here, right, you can see, so another way to think about, for those of you who are into math, another way to think about this is that it's the tangent, actually, of the curve at that time when time is equal to 0, right? That's really what this instantaneous rate of change means, it's the tangent of the curve. But like you can see, if you don't know tangents, don't worry about it. It's a tangent we don't need to go down right now. So, but what that really is saying, like at any moment, I could be thinking, right? And I could see what would, now again, these are way bigger than moments because I can't draw them kind of small enough, but you can see that these are all positive slopes here, right? So any place on this curve, my pi 1 would be positive. You can see though, what do you see is happening with that instantaneous slope? Again, imagine if I were centering it at different places, right? What's happening to this slope? It's getting less positive. That's exactly right. So the slope is getting less and less and less positive across time. And then finally, if I got up here, the slope, if this is where I centered my model, right? Well, I'm slightly off center there, but imagine I got it right there where it was exact, that the instantaneous rate of change right there at the top of the curve is actually 0, right? So if time were so that this is time is equal to 0 here, right? Then I would actually find a first order growth slope of 0, which would mean that the instantaneous rate of change at that moment is basically null. But of course, because I got this change in the rate of change, it doesn't mean that there's no growth overall. It just means that like at that moment, the instantaneous rate of change is 0. And then like what happens over here? Right after I hit that top of that curve, my slopes are actually going negative, right? Okay. So pi 1 is telling me about the instantaneous rate of change, or the growth slope, when time is equal to 0. So it's no longer just like my good old, so you don't want to just say like linear growth slope, because that's not really what it is anymore. It really is this change, this is this slope, or the change rate when time is equal to 0. Okay? All right, so then pi 2 is going to give me, it's telling me about the change in the rate of change, right? And we can also, you'll also hear people talk about this as like a curvature parameter. Sometimes people talk about it as well as like an acceleration parameter. But let's think about it as a curvature parameter, because we're talking about growth curves, right? So it's really sort of telling me, it's telling me about sort of how the change is changing across time. So going back to my example, if I say I'm starting at time 0 and a positive, so pi 1 is positive and pi 2 is positive, I'm starting off in a positive direction. I don't know how I did that, but so say we're over here, okay? So it's positive, pi 1 is positive, pi 2 is also positive. So as I'm adding, right, as I'm coming across time, the pi 1 is going to be multiplied by this, right? It's going to continue to be a positive thing, multiplied by 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, times squared is getting a lot bigger, and this coefficient is also positive. It doesn't really matter what the numbers are right now. Just know that it's positive and positive. So I'm starting off like this, right? Moving in a positive direction, but it's going to get increasingly positive across time, right? That's really what this pi 2 is saying. This positive pi 2 is saying that the rate of change is getting more positive across time. So I'm starting off with a positive rate of change at time 0, and it's getting even more positive across time. So if you think about what that looks like, it's like, okay, I'm like this, and it's getting more positive across time. That's going to give me a shape. Again, I'm exaggerating, right? How steep all of these things are depends on what the parameters are and all of that. But this is actually like the general format for like a positive and a positive. So you get this rate of change. You're starting off in a positive direction, you're getting even more positive across time. Does that make sense? Okay. So now let's imagine that you start off with a positive, but you have a negative quadratic. Okay. So different color. Okay. So I'm starting off positive, let's say. Starting off in a positive direction, but as time goes on, that quadratic, because it's getting multiplied times squared, it's gonna put increasing downward pressure. It's gonna be right. I'm gonna be taking I'm gonna take this negative pi 2, and I'm gonna be multiplying it by 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, etc. And so because it's negative and it's getting multiplied by time squared, as we go further and further across time, there's going to be a bigger and bigger negative component getting added to this. And so it's going to apply across time an increasingly bigger downward pressure on my curve, or like a negative pressure on my curve. And so I'm starting positive, right? Here I am. but like as time goes on, that pi 2 is going to be pulling me down. And so I'm going to get something, let's say, that looks like that. Right? And so this would be, this is like pi 1 is positive, pi 2 is negative. Yeah? What I like to call your classic frowny face. Right? Pi 1 positive, pi 2 negative kind of gives you like a sad face there, right? Okay. You with me so far? All right, we got 2 more to do. So, I'm running out of colors. So, I'll do black, I guess. Here we go. So now I've got a pi, maybe I'll use some, you all know what time I square. Okay, so now I've covered pi 1 being positive, but now let's imagine that pi 1 is negative, right? So now I'm starting headed in a downward direction. So pi 1 is negative, and pi 2 is, let's do pi 2 is positive. Right? So pi 2 is positive. So pi 1 is heading me in a downward direction, right? And pi is equal to 0. But now there's this upward or positive pressure being put on that, again, like as time goes on, that squared term is going to get bigger and bigger. So the positive pull is going to get greater and greater. And so what I'm going to end up with is maybe something, you know, again, if you have a long enough time span, you might only have this much data, right? So you might not see this whole piece or whatever. But again, you can see it matters where you center and everything. But this is actually a pi 1 negative, pi 2 positive. So again, this is what this is our smiley face pattern, right? So we've got a positive pi 2. Gives us that kind of shape. And then finally, I could have pi 1 is negative, and pi 2 is negative. And so now, what color have I not used? I've used them all, haven't I? So now I'm headed down, let's say, I'm headed down, and it becomes increasingly negative across time, right? So it's a negative that's becoming more and more and more negative across time. So this is like pi 1 negative, pi 2 is negative. So couple really important things to remember. To understand the shape of the trajectory, we have to really look at both of these things in combination. So you can't just look at pi 1 or really even just look at pi 2. You really need to look at pi 1 and pi 2, or I guess there'll be beta 1 and beta 2 when you look at your fixed effects in combination to understand what the shape of the trajectory is, right? And so, and second thing, I can't think of my first order slope as being a linear slope anymore, because linear implies a constant rate of change across time, and that's just not the case. What it is it's the instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0. So it tells me basically, you know, if I were to basically fit a little line, a little tangent line to that curve when time is equal to 0, what would that line look like? What would the slope of that line look like? So it is, you know, a linear slope in that sense, but it's really just a linear slope that is kind of a tangent to that curve at time is equal to 0. So we say it's the instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0. I want to say, I think those are kind of the big, and third thing is, it really matters now in terms, you really need to think through your centering now, because centering is not just going to change, like we saw that in a linear model, centering would change what your intercept is, right? But it wouldn't change what your growth slope is. But now, centering doesn't just change what your intercept is, it also changes what your first order slope is, what this pi 1 is, right? Because again, you know, because there's no constant rate of change, depending on where I center, I'm going to get a different pi 1, because again, pi 1 is really just sort of capturing like what, oops, clear there, but you know, it's really just sort of capturing what's that instantaneous rate of change at a given time point? Okay, questions about any of that? Does that all make sense? Pause there before we go to the cubic model. Good? Yes.
Often in the literature use explanation justifying rather than just I don't know how to or
Oh, you mean like, that's an interesting, and it wasn't a point I'd gotten to quite yet, but like, we could sort of cross that bridge right now, which is, when we've talked about piecewise models and now we're talking about polynomial models, right? And there are advantages and disadvantages to using polynomial models. So a huge advantage to a polynomial model, as you're about to see, is that it's incredibly flexible. But the disadvantage is that it's, I would say, often relatively it can be, unless you have sort of an a priori thought about something being polynomial, it's relatively atheoretical, right? So like a piecewise model, it really presumes that you know where to cut the pieces. And the pieces wouldn't have to necessarily be in the exact same place for every person. Like the example we're doing, they're 11 to 12, 12 to 14, 14 to 15. But then we also saw like discontinuities that were based on an event. Like I got my GED, and so that is when the slope is going to change, right? And so I can think of those kinds of change in slope models. I mean, I tend to think of piecewise models as sort of having the same set of pieces for people, but again, they might not occur at the exact same place with unstructured data or with, but anyway, but you have to have a theory for a piecewise model. Well, I guess there are people doing work that would say that you don't. I mean, there are exploratory piecewise models, but those are a little weird to me. But generally speaking, like you have to have a theory to have these different pieces, right? You sort of have to know, oh, I think the slope is going to change at this point. Whereas when you fit a quadratic model, you don't have to know where you think, like what you're saying is the slope is constantly changing across time, and I'm going to estimate the first order parameter and the second order parameter. It's going to tell me about the shape of the trajectory. So that can be an advantage or a disadvantage, because if you don't have strong theory, it can actually be advantageous to allow you to fit nonlinear trajectories in the absence of strong theory. But of course, the absence of strong theory should also give you pause, right? And yeah.
Rate of this change.
It's giving you the rate of the change in the change, right? It's telling you about, so you're getting this instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0, and then pi 2 is telling you about the change in the rate of change.
Which that number is to be multiplied by the time. So that's
Well, that pi 2 number gets multiplied by time squared. And that's why pi 2 has an increasingly large influence across time, because pi 1 is being multiplied by 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pi 2 is being multiplied by 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, etc., 49, right? And so on and so 64, blah, 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 blah. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes, question? Zero doesn't have to be in the center. It doesn't have to be in the center. Zero can still be wherever 0 makes sense for you.
Okay.
And so I don't think that you should think that we now need to not have 0 be at the beginning of the study.
Okay.
I mean, it
Okay.
could still be at the beginning of the study. That's not a problem. My point is just like to say that it matters where 0 is, not just in terms of where, like again, before when I had a linear model, right? Where I centered time only mattered for the intercept, because if I centered here, I would get a different intercept than if I centered here. But like now that I've got this kind of a model, where I center time is not just going to have an influence on the intercept, but it's also going to have an influence on that first order slope, which is just another caution to you to say, don't interpret it as a linear slope. Interpret it as the instantaneous rate of change when time and time squared are equal to 0, because that's what it is. And you can't, like, it's not going to be the same thing. It wouldn't be the same thing if you centered somewhere else. So you just have to, so you really can't interpret it. You can't interpret it in isolation. Like, that's kind of the bottom line thing. It's like, you cannot interpret. You used to be able to just look at this and be like, ah, that's the rate of change. And you can't do that anymore. Like, this, just knowing pi 1 in the quadratic model is like, you really can't say anything anymore, other than that's the instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0. But it doesn't, but you don't know how the rate of change is changing, because that's what pi 2 is giving you. And without knowing how the rate of change is changing across time, then just knowing the instantaneous rate of change at time equals 0 just doesn't tell you much at all, you know? And this is very similar, right, to, remember how we said, like, when you have interactions, you can't interpret a main effect on its own. You know, some people say you can't interpret main effects. I don't like to say it that way. I like to say all your effects need to be interpreted in the context of the interaction, right? Like, that number has meaning, but it's meaning in a whole system with an interaction, right? Like, you can't just take it out and look at it on its own. It doesn't have any meaning on its own. It has meaning in the context of the system or the model. And that's the same thing here now with the polynomial model. Before, pi 1 had meaning on its own. You could just plunk it out of your parameter estimates and talk about it, and it was like so easy to talk about. But now pi 1 doesn't have any meaning on its own, really. It has to be interpreted in the context of the whole system with all of the other parameters. Yeah? Which is why, going back to Marcus's point, that these models, well, maybe this wasn't your point. I'm going to put a point in your mouth, Marcus. Like, these models, though, then are can be much harder to sort of think about intuitively and to make sense of, like, conceptually and theoretically. Okay. Yeah. Pi 1? Quadratic model? Yeah. Quadratic model. Yeah, quadratic model. So it's a second, you can think of it as a second order polynomial model, or it's more commonly called a quadratic model, because we've got the squared term is the quadratic term, or the second order term, right? And second order just means that we've got time squared, time raised to the, I should have said that, but this order thing just means time raised to this power, right? We're always putting in all the lower order terms, and then we're adding one. So a second order model or quadratic model has time raised to the power of 0, level, right? Level 1 time is 0. Time raised to the power of 1, that's the instantaneous growth rate when, right, when time is equal to 0. And then we have this second order term, which is going to give us the change in the rate of change. Yeah.
So the change in the rate of the instantaneous rate of change will not be affected by whatever you intercept is. It's going to be what, if it's positive, it will be positive. It doesn't matter where.
That is true. That's true. You got a quadratic model.
Exactly.
And so the highest order term, that is actually going to be invariant. So in a quadratic model, where you center is not going to influence the squared term. It is going to influence the level, and it's going to influence the 0 order and the first order term. Yeah?
Thank you.
Sure. But now when we talk about the cubic model,
I was just gonna say.
I was going to say, we're fine. Now the quadratic is going to be a function of the third order term. So don't get too comfy with the second order term always being the same. But in this model, yes, right? All right. So is everybody good with this model? You ready to do cubic? What do you think? Cubic. I promise we're not going above
I was
cubic.
just gonna say you're not.
No, we're not. And honestly, like, I mean, a person could. They're quartic, quintic. Is it septic? I don't even know.
Septic sounds weird.
Septic does sound weird, and I'm not sure if that's 7, right? So there, but I know quartic and quintic. But I can honestly say, if you get to the point where you're like a quartic or quintic model, then you probably want to be thinking about whether there are other ways besides polynomials to kind of fit this model, because that's starting to creep. But anyway, so we're not going to go up cubic, but cubic is fun, and cubic is what we need to. So let me also say one more thing that you should notice. So I said we can think about the second order term as being like the curvature parameter, but notice in all of the things that I drew pictures that look like this, right? Like this, what's common about all of those things? We've got a change in the rate of change, right? But I only have one curve, okay? Do you notice that? So in a quadratic model, the rate of change is changing. But there is no change in the changing rate of change. So I know, and that sounds crazy, but think about what I showed you when I went 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we went 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. And remember I said this was, oh, no, not 2. 5, 1, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. Do you remember that? And so I said, look, the rate of change is changing. But I think this is so cool. But it's consistent. Like there's a consistent pattern to the way the rate of change is changing. So this rate of change, right, is like it's going up by 2 every time, right? So so there is a consistent. So the rate of change is changing, but there's only like one constant change in the rate of change, right? So now what we're going to talk about is we have just not just instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0 and a change in the rate of change, but we can actually have a change in the change of the rate of change. I know. Change. It's easy. Change to the change to the rate of change. But think about it this way. Think about it this way. Think about it this way. Okay. Imagine you are in your car, right? Imagine you're in your car and you could be in your car and like constantly driving. You could put cruise control on, let's say, and you could be constantly driving 65 miles an hour, right? Now, let's just imagine we're just talking about that period. We're not talking about getting on the highway right now. We're getting off the highway because obviously that's going to be change in the rate of change. But just for the period where you're on cruise control and you're driving 65 miles an hour, you're changing, right? Like you're going 65 miles an hour, but that rate of change is constant, right? So that would be like a linear model, right? Because you're like, okay. But now, so now imagine that you are, you're at a stop, let's say, and you are accelerating, right? So you put your foot on the pedal and you're accelerating, and so your rate of change is changing, right? So when you're accelerating, you're not actually just like going at a constant speed. Your speed is actually changing, right? So that's acceleration. Or you could imagine deceleration, but you could imagine that you're sort of accelerating or decelerating at sort of a, smooth pace, right? So I'm accelerating, right? Getting on the highway and I'm at the stop and I'm going, woo, and I'm going faster. But now I get on the highway and I need to actually get to that, right? I'm not, when you get on the highway, you don't just keep going up, right? You've hit a good speed, let's say, and now you need to like level off, right? So you need something like that, right? So you see what's going on here? Just imagine is I don't just have like one curve anymore, right? I've got, actually, we could talk about this. There's an inflection point in here, actually, where I'm going sort of from sort of this kind of shape to this kind of shape. We won't worry about that too much. But do you see how like there actually are 2 curves here, right? And so if you think about it, let's just think about it in terms of like our 2 parameters, or pi 1 and pi 2. Like here, mostly pi 2. Okay? So we're starting off here, and pi 1 is positive, right? And pi 2 is also positive. See that? So pi 1 is positive, and pi 2 is. So pi 1 is positive, and pi 2 is positive. Yeah? Everybody with me? But do you see what's happening up here? Like, it's like, yeah, pi 2 is positive, but not, we don't have like a constant positive of pi 2 off into like the nether region, right? There's something that's pulling this curve down. Do you see that? Right? We got sort of this other pull being exerted. Well, that's actually going to be this, to fit a model like this, we're going to need a third order polynomial. And what's happening here, if you think about it, is so pi 1 is positive because I'm starting like starting on a positive. Pi 2 is clearly positive because again, now, by the way, pi 2 is the change in the rate of change at time is equal to 0. So clearly that when I'm down here, right, like this change in the rate of change, like, yeah, okay, it's positive, right? But as I go along, there's this downward pressure that's kind of coming on. And so that means that pi 3 is actually going to be, what do you think? Negative. Exactly. So this kind of curve is a positive, positive, negative. So, okay, hold on. 2. So for our third order model, which is also called a cubic model, we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is time. Time squared is 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25. And now pi 3 is going to get multiplied by time cubed, which again, at the beginning is not going to have a lot of effect, right? Because it goes 0 and 1, just like time and time squared. So at the very beginning, whatever this cubic parameter is just like having a little tiny effect. But then the effect is going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on, and it gets a lot bigger it gets way bigger than the squared term, which was getting bigger than the first order term, right? So now we've got 8, 27, 64, and what? 125, right? So look at that cube term. So again, like a little tiny cubic, a little tiny negative cubic, it doesn't do much when you're first starting out, but as time goes on, like it's going to get multiplied by this really big number, and so it's going to have a big influence. So this term is really telling us about, again, the change in that, the change in rate of change, right? And in physics or whatever, sometimes this is called like a jerk parameter. And I think the easiest way to sort of think about this is that, again, this idea of like, yeah, I start out and I'm accelerating, but then like I have to put my foot on the brake, right? Because I can't keep accelerating forever, you know? So, so to kind of fit a curve that looks like this, I'm really using these 3 terms, this first order term, the second order term, and this third order term. And now the second order term really needs to be interpreted in the context of the third order term. Are you with me? Does that make sense? And the best way, I mean, I just find it easy to just sort of trace through and sort of draw these things conceptually. Like, so we just said this is a positive, and a negative, right? So we've got positive, and then quadratic is positive, so that's making me increasingly positive. But then there's this negative here that's also going to start. It's like a lurking thing that, as I go on, it's getting multiplied by these bigger numbers, and so it's going to put this negative, sort of this negative influence. And again, you could sort of imagine then if we went out enough, you'd end up with something that looks like this. Now, usually we don't. We might not have something that goes out this far, right? But that's kind of what it's saying, because like this, as this quadratic gets bigger, this negative is just going to overpower the 2 positives because these numbers are getting bigger so much faster. Does that make sense? So you can imagine, like, what if we had a negative quadratic, let's say like a negative first order and a negative quadratic, and a positive cubic, right? So let's think about what that would look like. you'd have something like this. You'd have like, okay, I'm negative, right? And it's becoming increasingly negative across time. So remember, that was something that looked like that. But I've got this cubic term, which is positive. And so it's going to start exerting influence. So I was headed like this, but now it's going to pull me positive, right? Again, I'm like, this is very exaggerated. This is a very long period of time. You might not actually have, you might only have this much, let's say, data. You might not have it all the way curving up, right? But do you see how that you get a shape that looks like that? And you can see, again, we've got two bends. So a cubic model gives you, it really gives you two bends. It gives you two curves. Again, it gives you this sort of way of sort of going from curve, you know. So if you wanted to fit anything that has sort of like an S-shaped curve, you would need a cubic model. There's no way to fit an S or an S-shaped curve with a quadratic model. You can fit a C with a quadratic model, but for an S, you really need a cubic model. And in fact, you can fit any curve that has, or any trajectory that has two curves with a cubic model. Because, okay, we could have positive, negative, positive, right? You have negative, positive, negative. And the magnitudes of these can be really different too, right? So if something's a really big positive versus a really small positive. So think about a model where you allow all of these parameters to randomly vary across people. So imagine that you have a model where the level varies across people, the first order trajectory, the second order, and the third order. So pi 1, pi 2, and pi 3. Imagine that you allow them to randomly vary across people. What does that mean? Well, if you think about it, that means that one person could have a shape like this, and somebody else could have a shape like this, right? And somebody else could have a shape like that, and somebody else could have any shape that I draw with two curves, because if I'm saying that those parameters randomly vary across people, so I'm allowing there to be variability across people, then that means some people could have positive pi 3s, negative pi, like you could have a person with a positive pi 3 and a negative pi 2 and a positive pi 1. You could have somebody else with a really negative pi 2 and a positive pi 3, right? Because all of those parameters are allowed to randomly vary across people, it means that as long as the shape only has two curves, theoretically, I could come up with a pi 1, a pi 2, and a pi 3 to fit that trajectory. If it has three curves, forget about it. Then I'm sunk. Then I need a quartic. But any shape with two curves, I can fit with a cubic. So I kind of like to liken this to, I have a sort of a spaghetti analogy that I like to use for like linear and piecewise and polynomial models. So, because again, remember, everybody can have their own trajectory. That's really important in these models, right? That's what's really important to remember, that each individual is going to have their own parameters potentially for allowing them to randomly vary. So imagine you have a box of spaghetti, okay? And you take the spaghetti out of the box, and like imagine these are the people in your spaghetti is going to be representative of the trajectories of the people in your study, okay? So you take the spaghetti out of the box, and with a linear model, just take the spaghetti, and you could just, right? Somebody could be positive, somebody could be negative, different, right? You could just take those spaghetti strands and you could move them all around, and that's how much flexibility you have with a linear model, which is quite a bit of flexibility actually, because people can start in different places and grow at different rates. Okay. Now, imagine a piecewise model. So let's say we're doing a three-piece piecewise model because that's our example for today. So you take that box of spaghetti and you break the spaghetti noodles into three pieces, right? And now I'm not modeling different intercepts here. I'm just modeling, slopes. But that means I could fit any trajectories that could fit with three pieces. Just imagine three linear pieces, right? And because if I allow all those pieces to randomly vary across people, somebody could be, negative, positive, negative, right? Somebody could be flat, positive, flat. Somebody could be, you know, positive, negative, flat, right? Anything I could do with 3 pieces of those spaghetti noodles put together, I could fit with my piecewise model. So way more flexible than the linear model, right? Okay. So now imagine I got a new box of spaghetti. It wasn't broken into pieces. I got my old spaghetti noodles from the linear model back. Okay, the polynomial model is like, I cook that spaghetti, right? And then I can take that spaghetti and pliably mold it into any shapes, as long as, again, if it's a cubic model, as long as there are just 2 curves. If I wanted more curve, if I wanted a quintic model, I could have 4 curves, right? So I pliably model that spaghetti into any different shapes I want, for any person. And you can see that that would give me even more flexibility than the piecewise model, right? But it comes at a cost. And that cost is interpretability. Because when you look at these parameters, unlike the piecewise model where you could be like, oh, well, that's, yeah, like with a piecewise model, I could say, oh, pi 1 is going to be, that's their growth rate from 11 to 12, and pi 2, or beta 2 is going to give me their growth rate from 12 to 14. But when I look at these parameters in a polynomial model, I got to put them all together and make sense of them all together to kind of understand what they're saying. So, the flexibility, I think, comes at the cost of interpretability and also potential lack of theoretical rationale. So there may be cases where there is a strong theory for a polynomial model, but I think often polynomial models get used when there is a lack of theory and you don't really know what to, because again, with the piecewise, you kind of have to know where the pieces, kind of have to know where to break those pieces, right? So, and with the piecewise model, we were kind of breaking the pieces in the same places for people, even if they're not exactly the same place, like because different people got their GED at different times, they're still like, I know where to make the breaks with piecewise model, right? I know where to make those breaks, whereas here, I don't have to know where to make the breaks. I got total flexibility, but it does come at the cost of interpretability and potential lack of theoretical rationale. Does that make sense? Okay. So we are going to, what time is it? I feel like it's almost break time. It is break time. Well, we are not getting to residuals today. No, that is clear. In fact, we're not probably going to get off, but we will get through this polynomial model. So let's take a quick break, 10 minutes, and then when we come back, we will fit the piecewise and polynomial models, and we will figure out how to interpret them, and we will compare them in LME form. Yeah, break. Yeah. I need to get all this stuff. Leave that there. Yeah, it's really hard like today. Well, that's all of that. Dog on the green. Yeah.
You know, like, you're like, I don't feel like, I don't want to. I'm good, like, I'm 40 and it's. Like when you go shopping. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just let me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Oh, I forgot to stop the thing during break. I guess that's okay. All right. So I can close this. I don't want to save the changes. And wait. Oh, I didn't put this slide in. Hold on. So I know. And I don't have time.
Because when I run this one, it comes out.
Okay, so everybody pull up the NYS. Let's see what's it called. It should be both in Husky CT and O. Go ahead and pull up the what's it called? NYS nonlinear RMD file. And if you see anything at the top that says you need to install packages that they aren't installed, just go ahead and click install on that. Because I just saw that. So just go ahead and do that. And let's see. I just want to make sure that we covered everything that I wanted to say. Okay, we did. Yes, we did. Okay, great. So what we're going to do here actually with this NYS data is we're going to compare 3 different models. We're going to compare a linear model, which is just a good baseline model, but as you might guess, it's probably not going to be our best model if the trajectory is not. No, we don't need those yet. Not yet. We might not even get to those today. We probably won't get to those today. We'll probably do those next week. Okay, so we'll compare a linear model to a piecewise model, and remember we talked about this idea of a 3-piece model versus a 2-piece model. And then we will fit a cubic model as well. And we'll talk a bit about sort of the variance, the random effects and the variance components as we go along. And remember, we are kind of taxing our reservoir here of what we can possibly sort of fit in terms of random effects. So theoretically, we can have 4 random effects, a random intercept and 3 randomly varying slopes. But just because we can have that doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? Okay, so we've already talked about the coding for our piecewise model. So let's just jump in and fit our piecewise model. Mm, So we're using the NYS nonlinear. That, go ahead and install your libraries. And we're gonna have to jump down because I've got a whole bunch of like notes here that we're already talked about. All of these notes. Okay. So, and we're using, oh, and I'll apologize too, because I realized there was one other thing that was different about the NYS 22 data set from the NYS data set. So at a certain point in time when I was prepping for class a couple of weeks ago, I thought, oh, I should change the scale of this attitudes variable because it's really small, like, and so the variances are really small. And so I decided to multiply everything by 100 so that the numbers would be bigger. Which is why I think a couple of weeks ago in the if you attach NYS, basically the only difference between NYS 22 and NYS 20 is that I multiplied exposure and attitudes by 100. So that is why those numbers are multiplied by 100. But I followed through on that as well as I should have, and also decided, and I did not do that at all for this, decided it was a bad idea because I have used this example for like a bazillion years. And so even though the numbers are small, it might seem small to you, they're the numbers I'm used to looking at. So I decided that was a really bad idea on my part. So, okay, so I apologize in advance. You don't normally multiply stuff by 100. It was just me being stupid. I mean, just trying to make it easier, but making it harder in the process. Okay. So having said that, we're going to use the NYS data set, which is going to, again, have really small numbers in it, but don't let that freak you out. Okay, so make sure you get your NYS data set there, attached or imported. I will go ahead and we'll look at the descriptives really quickly. Now these descriptives are not, oops, hold on. Descriptives.
So just creating the option.
Oh, I didn't, sorry. That's why I didn't call them. So my bad. We don't really need them, but okay. Oh yeah, I could just look at them. That's a good idea. Thank you. Let's just look at over here. Mean attitudes, 0.33. Mean exposure, -0.01. The standard deviation in attitudes is 0.27, which again, if you think about it, remember the variance is the squared standard deviation, right? So the variances on these things get small. The standard deviation for exposure is 0.3. Again, so this variances get small. Okay, we don't really care about those though. So, okay, here I created, and this attach and detach, you don't really need to worry about the attach and detach. That just is something that is helpful for like the markdown file actually. But anyway, so here I'm just creating the pieces, right? So for the piecewise model, I'm just saying like NYS, piece 1, right, is just going to be age 11 is less than or equal to 0. I want piece 1 to be 0. I want piece 1 to be 1 when age 11 is greater than or equal, right? And then piece 2, I'm saying when age 11 is, again, remember how we said this, when age 11 is less than or equal to 1, I want it to be 0. I want it to be 1 when age 11 is 2, and I want it to be 2 when age 11 is 4. And then piece 3, I do the same thing, right? So I've got age 11 less than or equal to 4 is going to be a 0. Age 11 greater than or equal to 4 is going to be a 1, right? And so I can create all of those pieces. And it's actually pretty easy to, I think the code is relatively easy actually to create these pieces, right? Now, remember I said that I might want a combined piece 1 that captures like ages 11 to 12 and 14 to 15. So we talked about how I could basically create what I called here, like, I'm just calling it like piece 1C, which is like piece 1 combined. And so it's really piece 1 plus piece 3, right? And so I can create that. So here I'm just saying like piece 1, right, at age 11 is 0, right? Piece 1C at 11 is 0. At 15, right, is age, so that's when age 11 is 4, is 2. And then in between here, I've got a 1, right? So it's going 0. Remember how we had 0, 1, 1, 1, 2? That's really what that's saying. 0, 1, 1, 1, 2. Well, that's what I'm saying. You don't really need the attach and detach. I found that when I was knitting stuff with the markdown file, that it was having trouble. So I had to put in like the attach and the detach. It's basically just attaching the data set, doing the stuff, like whatever. But you should not need that. You don't even need it if you're doing markdown. It just was something that I kind of needed to knit stuff the way that I wanted to. Okay, there we go. Again, there are other ways you could accomplish the same task. You don't have to use the coding the way that we did it. You could do, there are lots of things you could do, right? But this is relatively simple code. Okay, so our first model is our linear model, which we've seen before, and I've called that model 1. And we'll run model 1, and then we'll just look at it really, really quickly, because there's really not, I mean, just to kind of remember what our parameters look like. And actually, you know what? One of you write our parameters on the board. That would be good. And we're gonna like round to the, well, maybe we'll.
I can't read it.
I'll tell you what it is.
Okay.
The intercept is,
They're not.
okay. The intercept is 0.198. I guess we'll go with 3. And age 11 is 0.065 for the linear model. So this is just saying, right, that kids are starting out with the antisocial attitudes of about, let's call it like around 0.2, right? And then they're growing at a rate of about 0.065 points per year. And here, remember, it's a linear model, so we're expecting a constant rate of change, right? You with me? And I'm not going to worry too much about the tals on this model right now. So I want to get to the piecewise model. Okay. But I think it's helpful to kind of know what those predicted values are for the linear model, because we're going to want to kind of compare that. All right. So now in our next model, so for this model, just if you look at this model, I've got a note here. Only the piece 2 slope in this model is allowed to randomly vary in model 2. So this model is actually saying, if you think about what this model is saying, it's saying, okay, right, got 3 pieces. We've got the first slope and the sort of the spurt slope and the third slope. And it's saying that the first slope and the third slope are basically that growth rate is constant across people, but that spurt slope is allowed to vary across. And you can see that I did that because, again, here I've got, you don't have to have the 1 plus, but I've got 1 plus piece 2, right, is randomly varied. And you'll see, I think in a minute I will show you why I do that. But okay, so are you with me? So here, we were talking about if you had an unstructured matrix, how many parameters you would lose and everything. But in this case, because I'm only allowing piece 2 to randomly vary across people, if I were to actually collapse pieces 1 and 3, and I only allowed piece 2 to randomly vary across people, in that case, how many parameters, what would the difference in the number of parameters be? Like with this model, what does my tau matrix look like? Question. This model right here. So we've got So remember what we've got. We've got attitudes. I really wish I could here. So annoying. We've got attitudes. Maybe I'll write up here. Oh. Sorry. Okay. Here's our piecewise model, right? So we've got attitudes. Equal to, right? Plus 1 times, what am I calling this? 1? 1, right? Plus 2, 2, plus pi 3 times these 3, plus, right? All right. So, we got how many fixed effects? Oh, well, and you're not looking at level 2, but we don't have anything going on at level 2, right? So we've got pi 1 sub I is equal to pi 1 sub I, 2 sub I, I'll write this out, is equal to, so we've got theta dot plus R, right, not I. Pi 1 goes with piece 1, and what we're saying is it's beta 1 naught, and that's it, right? Beta 1 naught, and I'm saying I'm not allowing for randomly varying slope, right? Here, pi 2 sub I is beta 2 naught plus R sub 2I. Here I am allowing for a randomly varying slope. That's, I see that over there when I've got the piece 2 in there. And then pi 3 sub I is beta 3 naught. That's it, right? So you can see how many random effects do I have in the model? I have 2 random effects in the model, right? And if you see that? And if I fit an unstructured tau matrix here, what would my tau matrix look like? I'm going to go ahead and just call this tau 2, even though call it tau 1 if you want, because we don't have the others, but I'm just going to call it tau naught and tau 2 because it's the second slope. And then I have 2, right, which would be this covariance between the intercept and that, what I like to call the spurt growth slope, 12 to 14 growth slope. Right? And then I also, of course, am always estimating a sigma squared. All right, so now I forget what my question was. What was my question?
How many fixed effects?
Okay, how many fixed effects are there in this model? 4, right? I mean, the fixed effects are just my betas here, right? So I've got 4 fixed effects, 4 betas. I've got 2 random effects, right? Those 2 random effects, though, that doesn't tell me, when I want to sort of translate the random effects into the number of parameters, I've got to think about my random effects and how does that translate into a tau matrix, right? And if I'm assuming that the tau matrix is unstructured, so I'm allowing for a covariance between the 2, between the 2 random effects, right? Then my tau matrix looks like this. I've got tau naught naught. I've got the tau for the piece 2 slope, and I've got the covariance between them. So I've got 3 taus, right? And I've got also sigma squared. Yeah? Good? Does that make sense? Okay. Well, there you go.
Want me to write the other parameter?
Yes. Run this model. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the. Here we go. Let's go ahead and run model 2. Okay, and I didn't actually, here we go. Let's come down here. So if you come down to the MP, here are the model parameters. I'll come down here and look at these for a sec. So let's start by looking at the now is 0.21. All the other intercept basically about approximately 0.2. But look at the So let's actually round these to 2 decimals. Let's do it. Let's go 0.03, 0.09, and 0.0. Make the other one 0.2 and 0.2. Okay. So, what do you notice though? Okay, they're all positive. That's true. They are all positive. Like, does it seem like this is a linear trajectory? Remember, model 1 fit a linear trajectory. So in model 1, we were saying as age goes up by 1 year, basically your growth in your antisocial attitudes go up by 0.07. So regardless of whether it's ages 11 to 12, 12 to 13, doesn't matter, you're going up by 0.07. Right? Now what about here? This is saying what? Does it look like, I mean, again, if the linear model were the right model, what would I think that these, they should be equal, right? They should be equal. They should be like around 0.07 or something, right? And they should be equal, close to equal. Are they equal? No, not at all. And in fact, like, if you think about it, 0.03 to 0.09, that's literally 3 times as big, right? The slope is 3 times as big in that spurt period as it is 11 to 12 or the 4. Now, another important point. Two is not statistically significant. I'm sorry, piece 1. All right, where'd my, let me bring my mic over here. Piece 1, I'm sorry. Okay, piece 1, I'm sorry. Piece 1 is not statistically significantly different from 0, right? Do you notice that? The p-value is 0.082. Okay, that's interesting, right? Not different from 0. Huh. Let's remember that. Piece 3 is statistically significantly different from 0. P-value 0.032. Okay, interesting. So if you were somebody who lives and dies by p equals 0.05, what might you do? Which I would not recommend doing, but like what would somebody, but think about what might be the wrong thing to do in this situation. Well, okay, collapsing it is not the same as what if you got rid of piece 1? What if you were like, piece 1 is not statistically significantly different. Let's just get rid of it. I mean, you could do that actually. So what would that, I mean, it's not that that's wrong out of hand. Like if that could be right under some circumstances. So I'm not saying like ever get rid of a slope, but what would it mean if we got rid of the slope? We just got rid of the piece 1 slope because it's not statistically significant. That's right. I see your, yeah. For those of you at home, that's okay. It's exactly what I would have done. But like, yeah, the slope would be flat, right? It would basically be like saying we're not allowing. Remember how we started with that not first order, 0 order trajectory? It would basically be like saying we have a 0 order trajectory in that first time period, right? From 11 to 12, we have a 0 order trajectory, which means that we're allowing for level, but we're not allowing for change in level. So again, I'm not saying that like you can make sense of it. That could, like in certain circumstances, that could be sensible. But it isn't what we started off thinking that we wanted to do. What did I say we might want to test? We might want to test whether piece 1 and piece 3 are the same, right? Like, remember I said maybe those two pieces are the same as each other. So if I took out piece 1, would there be any way of testing whether they're the same? No, right? Like if I took out piece 1 at this point, I'd basically be saying there's a flat trajectory from 11 to 12, then there's this spurt from 12 to 14, and then there's some other growth from 14 to 15, right? So the other thing though is I think it's much less interesting that piece 1 is different from 0, statistically significantly different from 0, and piece 3 is not statistically significantly different from 0. I think it's much more interesting to look and see how similar do those pieces look to each other, right? And so here we don't have a test of whether they are the same in this model. I mean, we could do that. There are a variety of ways we could do that, but right now, with the output that we have, we don't have a test of whether piece 1 and piece 2 are the same as each other. But just eyeballing it, when I look at them, they're very similar, right? Like again, when we round to 2 decimal places, they're both 0.03. One is 0.026, the other one is 0.031. So it's not crazy to think about, maybe those are actually basically the same as each other. And why then is one of them statistically significant and one of them is not? Well, look, you can see why. Because, right? Because like, okay, here we go. This is like a little tiny bit smaller. Remember that we divide the coefficient by the standard error. That's where we get our t, right? We compare that to, you know, the t with degrees of freedom equal to whatever, whatever. So, I mean, when you do all of that, you get a p-value of 0.08, right? And you get this confidence interval that is like just below 0, right? To 0.06. And then here, when it's bigger, the standard errors are similar. The standard error is slightly smaller, but, and then, right? So then when we get the t ratio here, right? And this is, we get the t ratio here, it's 1.743. The t ratio here is 2.149, right? The t, we probably need a t of about 2 for statistical significance. And so this one is statistically significant, this one is not. But we're literally sitting on like either side of 0.05. So like the more important thing is to ask, before you ask, is either of these different from 0? If you think that they maybe should like be combined, the more important thing to ask is, you know, could they actually be the same? Because when I do a model where I fit piece 1 and piece 3 to have the same slope, I'm going to have a lot more information to estimate that slope. Like think about what I'm doing right now with the 3-piece solution. Like the slope for piece 1 is just based on that 11 to 12, that 0, 1, right? And the slope for piece 3 is just based on that 14 to 15, 0 to 1. But when I combine these 2 pieces together, I'm going to have so much more information. What's that going to do to my standard error? Decrease it, right? So my standard error is going to go down. So again, what do you think that means about the combined, when I combine piece 1 and piece 3 together, do you think that combined thing is going to be statistically significant? Yeah, definitely, right? My standard error is going to go down. So the first step here is not, I mean, and I think I just see people do this all the time. The answer isn't just like, get rid of everything that's not statistically significant. That's a bad strategy. Here, the strategy is, let's first see if we can actually make these equal, and this is very much like some of the examples we do in SEM, right? First, let's see if we can make these equal to each other. And then having made them equal to each other, we much better probably at that point to ask, is that combined slope different from 0 or not, right? Is everybody with me? No. So now we're going to fit the 2-piece model. So again, remember what the 2 pieces look like. We've got 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, and then 2 for piece 1. Then the second piece is going to look the same. So now we're going to be able to kind of get, oh, wait, but I should actually get the deviance here too, right? Here we go. So the deviance for this model is, okay, so the deviance for model 2 is negative 361.5. All right. Oh, okay. And here I'm just showing, we talked about this last time. I'm just showing how you could get the confidence intervals for the variance components, but I'm not going to do that right now because that takes a little time. We just did the model parameters. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, more confidence intervals. Oh, I'm going to skip the model that allows all of the slopes to randomly vary across people for right now. We can come back to that if we have time. Oh, no. Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it quick. I'll do it quickly. I'll do it quickly because there's probably a good thing to see here. Okay, so this is model 2B. I'm not gonna like perseverate about this too much, but I do want to show you something. So model 2B, so you can see here, I'm allowing piece 1, piece 2, and piece 3 to randomly vary across people. So now my tau matrix is a lot bigger, right? Now I've got a tau matrix that's like a 4 by 4 because I've got a randomly varying intercept, 3 randomly varying slopes, right? So how many variances are in that tau matrix? Like how many different unique components? Well, it's 4 times 5 divided by 2. So there are 10 unique elements in that covariance, variance covariance matrix. So we go from so basically we have the same number of fixed effects. We still have sigma squared. We go from a tau matrix that had three elements to a tau matrix that now has 10 elements because it's like an unstructured tau matrix. So we're picking up 7 variance covariance components, right? That's a lot, by the way. I'm not going to, no, we have sigma squared either way. So I'm just thinking about the tau matrix. So the tau matrix went from being like a 2 by 2 matrix, right? And we're just counting, right? And now it's a 4 by 4 matrix, and we're counting the diagonal and everything below the diagonal. And so we get to 10 pieces. That's a lot of pieces. Again, remember, multiple regression, you have 1 error, right? And now we're talking about sigma squared plus 10 different elements of the tau matrix. That's a lot. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and let's look at our summary. Okay, so you can see that I do get an answer, but I do see this sort of boundary is singular, like so, which means that like that again, you get this. Sometimes it's more of a problem than other times, but what this is really telling you is that you may have an issue actually getting sort of like inverting the variance covariance matrix, this tau matrix. And so again, like sometimes things are singular and everything runs okay, and that's okay. But sometimes it can be, sometimes it can be like a little bit more problematic. So you're going to get this message whenever, by default, LME4 is setting the tolerance value. So again, to like 1 times 10 to the negative 4th power. So like, if you sort of fall below that threshold, it's gonna say to you, oh yeah, this is singular. This is a singular model. Which okay, like, but that's, I don't know. Maybe that's kind of like an arbitrary threshold. So maybe that's not that bad. So, but I would argue, like, what if I set my tolerance at like 1 times 10 to the negative 99th power? Right? So like that's a much smaller number than 1 times 10 to the negative 4th power, right? So like I don't know, like I feel like when something's singular and I don't meet this tolerance threshold, but if I can go down to like 1 times 10 to the negative 6th power and it's no longer singular, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of an arbitrary threshold, but like if I really have singularity problems, I really have singularity problems if I fail this next one. Okay, so let's try. I don't think you have to really bother. Okay, so here we go. So is singular. So it'll say yes, true. Like it's evaluating it, and again, like at this tolerance value, it's saying you have a singular model. Singular models are not what we want to see. But let's try this. Now I've got 10 to the negative 99th power, right? 1 times 10 to the negative 99th power for my tolerance value, and I'm still flunking. So that, in my mind, is like, no matter how you cut it, That's a singular model. Like I can't really be like singular because that's pretty singular. But like you could try this and you could set this at like, here, watch. At some point, theoretically, let's try this. Okay, so the singularity is like when this is going to be a problem. The main time that this is going to be a problem is if we're trying to estimate parameters that we can't really sort of separately estimate, I think is a really good way to think about it. So do you remember how we saw earlier in the semester, we saw cases where, and because this is going to be diagnostic often of a singularity problem. Do you remember when we saw variance covariance matrices and we saw that like the covariance between two random effects was like 1? But then when we actually did a deviance difference test, we found that we could like it actually the model where we got rid of the variance and covariance, or the model where we got rid of the covariance fit as well as the model where we had it, right? So singularity, so the issue is like, you know, you're going to have singularity really means that you can't do the matrix manipulation that you really want to do. A singular matrix is one where there's a collinearity. Everybody know what collinearity is? It's like the opposite of orthogonality. Woohoo! So, right? It is. So
Orthogonality.
I'm sure it's in the dictionary. Orthogonality. It's the state of being orthogonal. So, okay. So collinearity, right? And we, again, think back to regression class. You probably talked about some of this in regression class. So collinearity, multicollinearity, right? We don't like to have too much collinearity in our predictors, or, you know, in this case, it's really, we're really talking about collinearity in the tau matrix, in the tau matrix, or in our, but, so if there's two, so a little bit of like collinearity is not necessarily bad, like that there's some relationship is not necessarily bad. But if you sort of imagine a situation, any situation in which you have a correlation matrix, I'll try to make this simple. Any situation, I've already blown that, I know, but you asked. So any situation in which you have a correlation matrix and you're gonna like manipulate that correlation matrix, like in factor analysis, or in this case, or whatever, often you're going to take the correlation matrix and you're going to like multiply it by, you know, its transpose, or you're going to invert it. You're going to do all these things. If you have a singular matrix, you're not going to be able to like invert the matrix. So think about it this way. So it's like, and inverting is like matrix division. So if you have a singular matrix, you have so much multicollinearity, which again, you talked about, I think, in regression class. You have so much multicollinearity. It's like if you have two things that are related at one. Let's imagine you try to, again, for a simple example in regression, you try to put in two predictors and they're completely linearly dependent on each other, right? So the correlation is 1. What happens if you do that in regular linear regression? Like bad things, right? It's like, you can't do that. You can't have a linear dependency. Right? Well, the same thing becomes a problem here in terms of like our tau matrix. There can be sort of two issues that can really wreak havoc with us when we have a tau matrix that is too complicated. So the first thing is that one of the taus is not, like, imagine you're trying to estimate a tau and it's really not different from 0. And if you have a variance that's not different from 0, I think we've talked about this a little bit, you end up with these boundary issues, right? You're trying to estimate something that's not different from 0, and that becomes really problematic, okay? And then the second thing is, and this will often happen in conjunction with the first thing, but the second thing that happens is, so you're like on the boundary there, right? You're trying to estimate a variance that's not different from 0. Now you're trying to actually estimate all of these covariances between that thing that isn't different from 0 and all of these other things. And if you think about it, like, remember how you actually get correlations? Maybe you don't. Do you remember how you get correlations? A correlation is the covariance between two things divided by the standard deviation of those two variances, of those two variables, right? Okay, so now imagine that you have a variable whose variance is essentially 0, right? So now that's on the denominator of this thing, right? Which is going to be problematic, obviously, because you got a 0 in the denominator. You can't divide by 0. Bad things will happen. So, and then if it's like slightly less, it's not slightly less, slightly more than 0, but really, 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 really small, what's going to happen? So obviously, if it's exactly 0, we're sunk. Right? You can't divide by 0, you're sunk. But if it's something that's super, 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 super tiny, so imagine like the limit as you go towards 0, right? The denominator is going to become really, 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 really small. So then the numerator is going to be big in comparison to the denominator, right? And so it's either going to get to be 1. So we're going to see those. Remember when we saw those correlations of 1 between variance components, right? And I said you can't, remember how I was like, you can't trust that, like, just because you see a really, really high correlation in that tau matrix, that it really means that these things are strongly correlated, because like that could just be, yeah. So that's why I said that. So like, so what are the signs that you've got problems? When you have variances that are near 0, when you estimate them. And again, what's near 0, it depends on the metric and everything. When you have correlations that are 1 or super close to 1 in that tau matrix, that's going to be also another sign that you have problems. Well, anytime you think about it, so now when I was talking about like collinearity and not being able to invert matrices and do the matrix manipulation that you need, we need this tau matrix. We need to be able to manipulate this tau matrix. If there's a correlation of 1 between 2 elements of the tau matrix, then I have a dependency in the tau matrix. So the dependency isn't actually sitting with the independent variables. That's how this is kind of different from what you talked about in regression. Where the dependency is sitting now is I have a linear dependency or an almost complete linear dependency between elements of my tau matrix. But I need that tau matrix. I use that tau matrix. And so that's the time when you're often going to get signals about singularity. And again, nothing is black and white. I think if you've learned nothing else from me, you've learned that I'm not a big fan of like arbitrary thresholds, right? So I don't know if I agree with the default that R superimposes that, like, so tolerance is giving you an idea about how big a problem is this, okay? And it's going to report a true. Like the tolerance is basically like, so as the tolerance gets really, 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 really small, it means that the collinearity is getting really, really, really big, okay? And so it takes as an arbitrary threshold 10 to the negative 4th power, right? So it's like 0.001, right? And then it says like, if your tolerance is below that, I'm going to tell you that this model is singular. You've got singularity problems. You probably should. This is a sign to you that like, oh, maybe I need to simplify my tau matrix. I really wanted all those random effects, but maybe I need to simplify my tau matrix. So we spent a lot of time in class showing how to think about the fit of 2 different models and how to decide about your random effects based on the fit of 2 different models. But there's also another thing that you should be thinking about besides just fit, which is like this, right? Like whether the fit is better or not, if like, you know, if it's too complex and I've got these singularity issues, then maybe I need to drop some elements out of my tau matrix so I get a simpler tau matrix so that I solve the singularity problem. So it's like, yeah, I wanted to have all of these slopes randomly varying across people, but maybe I really don't have the data. Like in this case, maybe I really just don't have the data to support it, right? And so I've got these collinearity issues, lead to singularity issues. And so, so anyway, so what I'm saying is, when you get an error message like that, you know, what it really means is you've got this singularity issue. And what I can say to myself is like, how bad is the singularity issue? Like it's already kind of bad if I'm getting this note, but like, how bad is it really? So that's when I was like, oh, okay, well, it's really bad here, right? Like this is really bad. I don't know how, you know, like that's a lot of zeros. 1, the tolerance value is less than, so I'm getting it still singular. Now, there's probably some point at which you can get a false here, and that's what I was showing here. Like, what if I do this? Is it So like, you know, I put 999 zeros before my one, right? If I use that as my criterion for singularity, I'm fine. Now, do I think that's a good criterion? Do I think you could defend that in a paper and be like, well, you know, it was not singular when no. I mean, obviously that's a problem. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is like, you know, the default for singular, maybe that's not the right term. I don't know. But like you can explore like how bad is your singularity problem? And I would argue in this particular scenario, I think it's pretty clear that we have a bad singularity problem. Whereas like it could be the case that for some other model, yes, you get it singular, but when you change this to -5, it says false. And to me, again, like these are the places where you need to think about your model and all that stuff. But that's a much less severe problem, right? Maybe you wouldn't call that a singularity problem. Because maybe you would just say that's fine, right? But this, I think, this -99, I think any reasonable person would be like, you got a singularity problem. Does that make sense? The default, I believe, is 10 to the -4th. So this is, I believe, this is actually, double check me, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Okay, so I've written a whole bunch of stuff here that sort of explains some of all of that and then gives you some references. So, okay. So what I'm saying here is we have like massive singularity problems here. So we can compare the two models. Oh, it's 11:30. Okay. We can compare the two models, but you know what? Because it's 11:30, we won't compare the two models. We'll just say like, well, and here's where I'm saying like, oh, here, I do have two models. So remember I said 2 and 2b differ by 7 parameters. The tau matrix for model 2 only had 3 parameters. The tau matrix for 2b has 10 parameters, right? So we're estimating the same number of fixed effects. We're estimating a sigma squared in both cases, right? But by getting rid of the random effects for slope 1 and slope 3, actually gotten rid of 7 parameters, all 7 parameters. And if you look at this, you can see that model 2 is estimating 8 total parameters, right? And the difference in deviance is with 7 degrees of freedom, which again would be from a model fit perspective. What does that mean? I can get rid of those 7 parameters. Yes, Claudia. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's like if you have massive singularity problems, that kind of trumps model fit. And that's kind of what I was trying to say. It's like model fit is great, but there are actually scenarios in modeling where you can fit a model that is not actually identified and get a chi-square value or get a model fit, right? And then you have to ask yourself, like, do I trust the non-identified model even if it has better fit? And I think the answer is, generally no. So, I mean, I would say, and this is a case where, like, that's why I would say, like, what if the model fit were way better and the tolerance is like this? Well, I can't imagine the model fit being way better when the tolerance is like this. But I would say even if the model fit is better, if you really have singularity problems, you can't really, you need, like, you can't totally trust your estimates, right? Like it's too complex a model for your data to really support. Sometimes simpler is better. So yeah. So I would say if you have real model problems, that does trump model fit, right? Like you can't estimate the parameters well. It doesn't really matter if it fits better. The way to think about it. But anyway, in this case, it's nice because it all lines up. The model fit is actually not significantly worse when we get rid of these effects. And that is often what you'll actually see because we're not doing a good job actually estimating all of it. If you think about this, it's like we have taken this one residual and we've broken it into 11 pieces. No, that's a lot. That's a lot. Okay. Anyway, yeah, right. So I said, it's a good thing that we favor this model because we really would not be on solid ground if we did. Okay. All right. So, and the next thing about this actually is that it does also mean that like the three-piece model and the linear model, they differ by only two parameters because we really have the tau matrices are of the same dimension here, right? We have two additional fixed effects, but we have basically the same, we have the same number of random effects. And I don't think we didn't write down what the linear model
Deviance was.
but it was bigger. It was bigger. It was bigger. I don't remember. what.
Jennifer's gonna look in the packet.
Okay, Jennifer's gonna look in the packet for us. Okay, so now we can conclude that the three-piece model fits better than the two-piece model. And now let's actually run the three-piece model fits better than the linear model. And now let's run a two-piece model where we're actually constraining the slopes from 11 to 12 and 14 to 15 to be the same. And then we got to get to our polynomial model. Okay, so that's model 3. And here comes our summary for model 3. And you can see now for model 3, we just have two pieces, right? And not surprisingly, the parameter estimate, the first piece is kind of somewhat in between the two pieces that we remember how before it was like, was it like 0.026 and 0.031 for the two pieces? Now it's like 0.029, which is kind of right in the middle of what we had. So piece 1, right, has a slope of, let's call it 0.03. Piece 2 has a slope of 0.09. The intercept is 0.21. So it's very similar actually to our three-piece model. And as I predicted, look, our standard error is quite a bit smaller. I think it was 0.14 and 0.15 for the two pieces. But now it's dropped down to, or not 0.1, 0.014 and 0.015. Yeah. And now it's dropped down to 0.01 or 0.011. So the standard error is quite a bit different. It's quite a bit smaller. And so now the combined piece, right, is now it's much more 0.04 to 0.08 or whatever. And now this is at like a 0.01 level. It's statistically significant. Okay, so that's all good. So we would favor, oh, and the deviance. The deviance here is negative 361.4. So look at the difference in deviances there. Negative 361.4 versus negative 361.5. So like really the deviance basically doesn't change at all, meaning we're going to favor the two-piece model. I see hands, yeah. Yeah, this is the one where we combine, and that's why I'm calling it piece 1 combined. On C is the piece 1 combined, yeah.
So we're assuming that they're the same.
Yeah, we're assuming they're the same slope. If that weren't a fair assumption, this model fit would get way worse because this model fits basically the same as the model where we let those slopes vary. That tells us like making this constraint doesn't actually significantly worsen the fit of our model. So it's a reasonable constraint to make. You all with on that? Yeah. Okay. Now we got to get to polynomial models because that's your homework. So having done all that, we're going to fit a cubic model. Okay, so here's everything that I said before the break about cubic models. And this is what the polynomial terms are going to look like here for our cubic model, right? So we're going to have time squared, and then time cubed. So we saw this on the board before. We actually just need to square our age 11 slope, and then we need to cube our age 11 slope, and then we're going to fit that model. Okay? And so I've got some code that just creates an age 11. So I'm calling it age 11 SQ and age 11 cubed for age 11 squared and age 11 cubed. And so I create those, and you can see it's really simple codes to do that. Because again, as long as I know what I'm doing, it's pretty easy. So now I am gonna, well, this one has all the random effects, but actually let's go to the polynomial model that has random effects for just one slope, because not surprisingly, like given all of our conversation about the too many random effects with the piecewise model, we're gonna see the same thing with the cubic model. So let's go to model 4C and fit model 4C first. So here we've got attitudes are predicted by, right? We've got the age 11 time variable, age 11 squared time variable, age 11 cubed time variable. And right now, my random effects are a randomly varying intercept, and I'm allowing for a randomly varying age 11 squared slope. We can always go back and kind of look at the other random effects if we have time, but let's just sort of go there. So we're going to run this model. And let's look at our output. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so here we go. And now this is where you're going to notice the first thing that is really, really, really different. Oh, actually, everything is really, really different. So look at our fixed effects. Our intercept is 0.21. So that looks really similar. And that still has kind of the same meaning, right? So it's like our predicted score at age 11 when time and time squared are equal to 0. But now look at these other things. How do I interpret these things? Well, first thing that's interesting is my age 11 time slope is not statistically significantly different from 0. So what does that mean? That means the instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to 0 is basically 0, meaning that like at age 11, that instantaneous slope at age 11 is basically flat, like no real growth at that, but just at that moment. That doesn't mean that between 11 and 12 there's no growth. It just means like instantaneously, like right on the 11th birthday, that basically the tangent line to that curve at age 11, that instantaneous rate of change is basically not significantly different from 0. Oh, it is negative 0.02 if we want to go to just 2 decimal places. And then we've got age 11 squared. So remember, as we go up in years, we're going to take this and we're going to multiply it by 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to take this one and multiply it by 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, right? So age 11 squared is 0.06. And age 11 cubed is negative 0.01. So now you kind of just like have to, again, like, what does that mean? Okay, so the first thing I do is I try to think in my head, what does that mean? So it kind of means I'm starting off flat at age 11, right? But the squared term is positive, so that means it's gonna pull me up, right? But the cubed term is negative. So eventually that's gonna kind of flatten me out and maybe even have a downturn if I were to go along long enough. And really, I can't really make much sense of these parameters until I get predicted values for them, right? Until I actually compute predicted values, it's really hard to make sense of them. So how would I do a predicted values for this? Well, I think it's actually helpful to like think about this, about doing this, right? Like by hand for this one, because it's pretty easy. So the predicted value, let's get age 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Okay. So at age 11, think back to my formula, right? So I've got it's going to be like the intercept. So it's going to be this right? Plus pi sub 1, right? Times age 11.
Yeah.
Plus pi sub 2i times 11 squared, right? Plus pi sub 3i times cubed. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if I still feel
The chairs are still the issue.
Oh, okay, there we go. Age 11 cubed. Okay, so we got this, right? So at each time point, so when we're going to like age 11, 12, 13, and 14, 15, we just basically need to apply this, remembering what our coding was from the time variable. So at age 11, here are my parameter estimates. My predicted value at age 11 is going to be 0.21 times 1, right? Plus negative 0.02 times 0, right? Because 11 is everything 0, plus 0.06 times 0 plus negative 0.01 times 0. So obviously, write all those out, but just for completeness. And so it's going to be 1, right? Now, at age 12, the predicted value is going to be 0.21 times 1, right? Because this is always times 1, plus negative 0.02 times 1, plus 0.06 times 1, plus negative 0.01 times, yeah, exactly, is, hold on, I brought a calculator for this. I remembered a calculator today. 0.24, thank you. All right. So next, we got 0.21 times 1 times minus 0.02 times 2 plus 0.06 times 2 squared, which is 4, right? Plus negative 0.01 times 2 cubed, which is going to be 8. Is everybody with me? And so now we've got negative 0.08 plus 0.24, which is 0.16, right? Minus 0.04, which is 0.12, right? That's right, 0.12, plus 0.21, which is, check me on this, actually, no, I'm right. 0.33. Now, 14.21 times 1 plus 0.02 times 3 plus 0.0 times 3 squared, which I'm just going to put 9 in here for us. So we plus minus 0.01 times 27. And you can see, again, what I'm talking about, where like that cubic term is getting, right, this is small, but now it's getting multiplied by 27. Now we've got negative 27 plus 54, which is 27. I'm leaving off. Minus 6 is 21, right? Plus 21 is 42. So it's going to be 0.42. And then finally, we've got 0.21 plus negative 0.02 times 4 plus 0.06 times 16 plus negative 0.01 times 64, right? Again, so now I've got negative 64. What's 6 times 16? Yeah, the answer is 0.45. You're right. I know that. I remember that actually. Okay, so the answer is 0.45. So now take a look at these predicted values for a second. And think about what we saw on the piecewise model. Do you remember? Do you remember how like the first and third piece, here's our piecewise model. So the piecewise model is saying you start at 0.21, right? And then between time points 1 and 2, you grow at a rate of 0.03. And then between time points 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, you grow at a rate of 0.09, right? And then at the last time point, you go back to a growth rate of 0.03. So if I wanted to get the piecewise model, if I wanted to get the predicted values for the piecewise model, right, I can do the same thing. Time 1, it's 0.21. Time 2, it's 0.21 plus 0.03, which is 0.24. Right? Time 3 is 0.21 plus 0.03 plus 0.09, which is 0.33. Time 4 is 0.21 plus 0.03 plus 2 times 0.09, because remember our coding, Piecewise model, which is going to be 0.18 plus no, not piece 3 yet, sorry, stop there, which is going to give me 0.042, which is 0.09 more than we had here, right? You can think about it that way too. It's like this, add 0.03, now add 0.09 to it, now add another 0.09 to it with the piecewise model, and then finally add another 0.03 because that's what I have at piece 3 with combined or the 3. And so that also gives me 0.45. So if you look at this, we get the exact same predicted values, whether we use the piecewise model or the polynomial model. And in either case, we are definitely doing better. We're like the linear model doesn't really make sense. What's the predicted value here when you're 15? Think about that. When you're 15, what's the predicted value here? It's going to be 4 times 0.07 plus 0.20, right? Which is going to be 0.28 plus 0.2, which is actually going to be 0.48, which actually means we're overshooting. Well, again, you haven't looked at the actual values, but that's the next thing I would do is look at the actual values for the means at 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. And my model should, like a good model should get me closer to my, again, this is an unconditional model. The good model should get me closer to my actual means at those 5 time points. And you'll see if you look at the actual values that we do come closer with the piecewise or the polynomial model to actually getting the means at each of the time points than we do with the linear model. But that makes sense because, again, like the actual data looks kind of like this. Again, this is exaggerated, but when I fit a linear model, I'm going to fit something, you know, I have to fit something that tries to fit through there. And so I'm not, you know, whatever, it's not going to do nearly as good a job, right? Does everybody kind of follow the logic there? So then how do I interpret these parameters? It's really easy to interpret the piecewise linear parameters, right? Because I just said, like, oh, people grow 0.03 points per year from 11 to 12 and from 14 to 15, and they grow about 0.09 points per year from 12 to 13 and 13 to 14, right? So I've got sort of like these different phases where I've got different slopes. But like, how would you interpret these cubic parameters? I mean, obviously first order, second order, third order slopes, but like,
Change and change.
yeah. I mean, and you can talk about like, yeah, okay, the third order parameter is telling me about, like, it is telling me about the change and change, but like, so you can say all those things that we said before the break, but like, if you want to kind of break it down and make it a simple story to somebody, the only real way to make this kind of these parameters, I think, the only way to make these cubic parameters come alive for somebody is to compute those predicted values. And to graph, like, so you can compute the predicted values, you can graph the predicted values, you can talk about the predicted values, but like, you know, the parameters on their own, I mean, again, they mean something. If you do this for long enough, you'll start to get a sense of what they mean, like without even graphing them, but sort of like in the gestalt of what they mean anyway. But like the only real way to make sense of these cubic parameters is through predicted values, I think. So that's a huge, I mean, it's a bit of a downside for the cubic model over the piecewise model is interpretability, right? So if really these fit the same way and they give you the same predicted values, from an interpretability standpoint, I would favor the piecewise model over the cubic model. But is the fit the same? Should look at what's the deviance for the cubic model? We've got it up here, right? Deviance is negative 328.3. What was our deviance before? Oh, negative 361.5 or 0.4, right? 0.5 or 0.4. Okay, so which model? Okay, well, hold on. Are these models nested models? Yes or no? No, definitely not. The cubic model and the piecewise models are not nested, right? Because we're taking out certain time slopes and putting in other time slopes, right? But in both of these cases, both of the models that I ran actually had 2 random effects, a random slope, a random intercept, and they both had the same number of fixed effects, right? Because in both cases, oh no, they don't actually. I take that back. They did when I had the 3-piece model, but with the 2-piece model, I actually have fewer parameters because I was able to combine piece 1 and piece 3 together, right? So the cubic model and the 3-piece model have the same number of parameters, but the 2-piece model actually has 1 fewer parameter because I was able to combine two of those time variables together, right? So again, they're not nested, but which one has the lower deviance? The what? The cubic model? The piecewise model. So don't let the negatives throw you. Deviances can be negative. Deviances can be positive or negative, but smaller is always better. So with negative numbers, a bigger negative number is actually smaller, right, than a smaller negative number. So in this case, the piecewise model is like negative 361.4 or negative 361.5, whichever one you choose, as compared to negative 328.3. So, and again, because the, like, if you compared the 3-piece piecewise to the cubic, because they have the same number of parameters, like the one with the lower deviance is always going to have the lower AIC, BIC, any of the ICs. And in the case of the 2-piece model, it's one fewer parameter. So it's going to get that, even that added edge. So I know that whatever information criterion I use here is going to favor either of the piecewise models to the cubic model in terms of model fit, which is good because, again, from an interpretability standpoint, I also think that I would give the piecewise model the edge. Questions about any of this? You with me? Does that make sense? So just to recap, the magic of, what's the magic that happens in all of these piecewise and polynomial models and discontinuous models, all of the sort of magic is happening really outside the program. Outside, you have to create these time variables, but really the thing that you really have to think through is what do you need, what do you want these time variables to look like? How do you code time to get the pieces that you want or to get the polynomial terms that you want, right? And then there's really nothing new in terms of like the way that we write the code for the model but what's really new here is thinking through how to create those time variables in a way that gives you the model that you want. So, I often will sit down when somebody's got, a problem and they're thinking through something like this, right? The first thing is like, what do you think right? What do you think this trajectory is going to look like? Okay. And how can then I sort of come up with my table of like, what should the time variables look like? And then once I have that, then I can move into the modeling framework and model it pretty easily. So there's some upfront thinking about how to code all this stuff that is really just a matter of sort of logic and problem solving, not really so much, modeling. Questions? Yes. Oh, it might be wrong. Let me see. It does look like it's starting up. So hold on, let me see. What page is that? Where's the cubic? Oh, yeah. You know what? And I apologize for that because I just grabbed this out of some old files that I had for the book and did not even look at it carefully. But now that you say that, that was actually something that got changed in the editing process afterward because I looked at this and was like, it's wrong. So you're right. So as soon as you said it, I was like, oh crap. Yeah. No, that should be positive, right? And then negative and then positive. So it should be positive, negative, positive, and the other one should be negative, positive, negative, right? So those, yeah. And in fact, maybe it's hard to see with black and white. Maybe the colors make a difference, but you're absolutely right that the one on the left should be positive, negative, positive, and the one on the right should be negative, positive, negative. And again, you could imagine having other things too that are like negative, negative, positive, or whatever. So yeah, I will go and I will fix that. But unfortunately, it's attached to that picture that I didn't look too carefully enough. Yes. Oh, yeah. So last thing in our last 4 minutes here. So you've got a homework, surprise, this week. And for your homework this week, you're going to use the same data set that you used for this homework that's due this Thursday, right? Where you fit a linear and a piecewise model. And so what you're going to do for this homework is fit a polynomial model. So it's a quadratic. It's not going to be a cubic. So shoot, right? You're going to fit can't do that with 4 time points. You're going to fit a quadratic model. And then you're going to, most of the questions are actually about fitting the quadratic model and sort of interpreting that. But then there are also a couple of questions. There's like maybe 2 questions that ask you to compare the quadratic and the piecewise model. So we can't get all of the homeworks graded necessarily in the next couple days after you hand it in. But what we can do is look at the table. Remember how you're putting a table of your codes, your time codes for your linear and piecewise model? So we will look through those quickly as soon as you hand things in. And if there's a problem with the table code, we will let you know right away so that you can sort of fix that before you do your next homework. Now that's no guarantee that you've run everything right on your last homework, because your table code could be good, but you could have messed up when you put it in R, or you could have run the wrong model or whatever. And we will eventually obviously grade the homeworks and get them back to you by next week. But we will quickly, once you hand them in, just look through those tables and let anybody know if there are problems with the way you tabled things, because you're likely to, that would be a problem that would be likely to kind of continue into the polynomial homework. Does that make sense? Okay. I think that's all I had to say. Any last minute questions? Okay, so next week is all about residuals and maybe covariances a little too. Yeah. All right. And then Thanksgiving, right? I can't believe it. All right, see you all next week. A recording.